Okay, hi everybody. It's Richard Kravitz, director at UCCS. It's great to be with all of you for this fourth and last session of our UCCS undergraduate research showcase today. We're really proud of all the students for all the work that they've done. And we're really grateful to all of the internship hosts for making this part of our unique combined academic experiential learning opportunity for students available to them. So thank you so much for that. We have a lot to get through, so let's get going.
All right, fantastic. So the format for our undergraduate research showcase is that each student will present. After the student presents, we will take one question from their internship host site. If there are no questions from the internship host site, then we will go ahead and have the question come from our academic team. There's going to be, after each student, there's only going to be one question from the internship host site afterwards. But however, we will have open Q&A at the end where either the audience or the academic team can ask the question, and it could be to any of the students that presented today. All right, so with that, we will go ahead and start with our first student, Zach Howard, whose home campus is UC Santa Barbara, and who interned this term at the California Fair Political Practices Commission, or FPPC.
How's it going, everybody? I'm here to present jail time for avoid conviction inequity in California's pretrial detention. So as of 2020, 62% of jail beds in California were being filled by pretrial detainees awaiting conviction. There have been multiple failed attempts at reforming California's pretrial justice system in recent years. Even just on the November ballot, Proposition 25 to replace cash bail with risk assessment systems failed to pass. And so with this project, I wanted to research why our state jail population is disproportionately filled with people in pretrial detention awaiting conviction, how cash bail affects the problem at hand, and what the possible next steps are at reform. And from that, I hypothesized that as cash bail increases, the percentage of people in pretrial detention for that respective crime will increase because of the inability to pay bail. And subsequently, those percentages will be greater than the percentage of people held pretrial for reasons outside of bail, which is commonly due to recidivism laws and regulations. And after examining a background of the consistent disparity between pretrial detainee and convicted jail populations, as seen in Figure 1 of my poster from 2003 to 2020, I looked at the county level for my analysis in Figure 2, comparing Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Orange County due to their bail schedules being public, and because as I was looking, their crime rates were relatively similar based off respective population. I then picked the most common crime out of 3 separate categories to account for the varied bail prices, and from there I calculated the percent of people in detention due to the inability to pay and compared each result, and looked at these comparisons in relation to pretrial incarceration rates unrelated to bail. And ultimately, while parts of the data supported my hypothesis, there was not a conclusive or consistent correlation between my variables. Cash bail and recidivism laws together play the largest part in pretrial detention rates, with the latter making up the majority in most cases. And so I conclude that in order to implement effective policy, we must look at cash bail and recidivism together to begin amending the disproportionality in our judicial system's pretrial administration. And that's all I've got. Thank you guys for listening. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much, Zach. And so we're going to first go over to the audience. If there is anyone from the FPPC that would like to go ahead and ask a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I'll call on you. All right, and if not, then our academic team. All right, Professor Butters.
Hey, Zach, great job here. I am impressed with this, and I've been impressed with everybody else's posters the rest of today, but I like this one in particular. And I have a question for you about the longevity or the staying power of your findings here, or I guess non-findings, I guess, right? So part of the impetus for you doing this project was in that Prop 25 in November 2020, but they've been trying, as you mentioned, for forever to get reform in California's penal system. Do you think your lack of findings would hold if you kept expanding your data further and further back through like 2010 or something? Do you expect to see some variation? What do you think?
I think the lack of findings would probably stay consistent if I went backwards and looked towards 2010 from what I was finding. Because as I was noticing, data is becoming more public as the years come towards the current era. I requested data from many different counties on their bail schedules, and they didn't want to provide them. And if they are, they're in the process of providing them. So it's kind of difficult. And so I was limited on that front. And so I feel like if I look back past that into 2010, it'd be very similar, because just now, due to the the pressing of the public wanting reform in this area, that we're seeing different counties and different organizations become more liberal with their data expositions and everything.
Right on. So data availability is key here. That's awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Great job, Zach. And then so our next student is Olivia Tran. Her home campus is UCLA. And this term she interned with the California Energy Commission Communications Office.
You go ahead and put it full screen. All right, good afternoon, everyone. The significance of the US Census extends far beyond a mere headcount. In reality, the census cannot be more consequential because census data guides the allocation of federal dollars into critical social welfare programs. However, many populations are left out of the count, especially minorities, people experiencing homelessness, children, immigrant communities, and so much more. Essentially, some areas of these hard-to-count populations are not receiving their fair share of money. This leads to my hypothesis that California counties with more hard-to-count populations will receive less funding into their social welfare programs, particularly education funding. My research design looked at all 58 counties' likelihood of no response rates to the census and examined if they impacted how much each county received in Title I education grants per capita. I chose Title I education grants as my dependent variable because these grants specifically provide funding for low-income communities, and any undercount would leave these populations at a greater disadvantage. As shown in Figure 3, my analysis did not find support for my hypothesis. In fact, I found the opposite relationship, that hard-to-count communities received more funding per capita. This is likely due to hard-to-count communities also overlapping as low-income communities, meaning they would be more likely to receive Title I grants anyway. But this still does not prove that communities are receiving their fair share of funding across all the different types of programs driven by census data. Although Title I grants did not show to be impacted by hard-to-count populations, more research should be done across other types of education funding to gain a more holistic understanding of the effects of the census undercount. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Olivia. And so we're going to go ahead and take a question from the audience. So Sandy Louie.
Hi, Olivia. This is Sandy. And first, as a former K-12 education reporter and somebody who worked at the Census Bureau, this spoke to me in all different ways and also in communications. First, I want to thank you for your time at the Energy Commission. We loved you so much. We're having you transition to a media intern. But in terms of your study, did you look at in terms of what the kind of scope of the dollars means with the undercount and how and did the numbers, it may be too early as to what has happened in the past year with COVID-19, because a lot of students and the ADA numbers may not be accurate because of how it has occurred in the past year and what that may mean at the same time with the 2020 census, where they will be starting to use those numbers to reshape redistricting and all these various numbers.
Yes, hi. Hi, Sandy. Thank you for your generous words. And in terms of the research about the scope of the dollars with the census, I think, my dependent variable is very limited just because it's a small subdivision in the wide umbrella that is education funding. So if we were to talk about the wide scope, I think with different types of grants, we would see different types of results. Just because Title I grants are limited to low-income communities. So that kind of narrows down my research and the findings that I would have derived out of that. And then in terms of the impact of COVID-19, I would absolutely expect there to be huge disparities in the counts, just because COVID-19 meant less people knocking on doors, fewer access to Wi-Fi hotspots that's a huge barrier to getting people to the census. So we haven't seen full results from the 2020 census count yet, but I do expect there to be even larger miscounts just from all the impacts that COVID-19 has given towards the count. So yeah, I think it'll be really interesting when we do see data coming out of 2020 to see how that compared to 2010 and previous years as well.
Thank you, Olivia. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Sandy, for the question and also for hosting Olivia this term. And great job, Olivia. Thank you. And so our next student is Forrest Pasteurl, and his campus is UC Davis. and this term he interned with Environment California.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Going to share my screen, and there we are. Okay, so my research focused on an analysis of zero-emission vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure in California. So the transportation sector is the main culprit of greenhouse gas emissions within California, accounting for 41% of total emissions, according to the California Air Resources Board. So one of the most prominent proposed solutions to curb this issue is the transition towards zero-emission vehicles, which I refer to as ZEVs. So how will production of ZEVs meet certain policy goals of greater ZEV presence on California roads? And what is the relationship between ZEV sales and charging infrastructure throughout the state over time? So my hypothesis is that an increase in ZEV sales will likely result in a corresponding increase in the number of charging stations statewide over time. So this research investigates ZEV sales and EV charging infrastructure statewide from 2011 to the year 2030. In order to fully understand it, the state will plausibly reach the goals of 1.5 million ZEVs by 2025 and 5 million ZEVs by 2030, as per Governor Brown's 2018 executive order. So as shown in Figure 2, results demonstrate that when adjusted proportionally, ZEV sales and public EV charging stations demonstrate a correlation in matching growth trends over the past decade, with the ZEV market share regression also demonstrating positive linear growth over time, as shown in Figure 3. Figure 4 demonstrates a polynomial regression of ZEV cumulative sales based on the current trajectory that we're on, and overall shows a high likelihood of reaching the 1.5 million ZEV target, but the 2035 million ZEV target is uncertain. So policymakers should continue to promote investment of EV charging infrastructure in anticipation of future growing demand for ZEVs to help meet those policy targets. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Forrest. That was great. So in terms of attendees, so the question, if there's anyone from Environment California, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, and I can go ahead and call on you to ask a question of Forrest. All right, and if not, our academic team. All right, Professor Palmer.
Thanks, Forrest. My question is, which direction do you think has a stronger role? The growth of charging stations is more likely to lead to more people buying electric cars, or do you think it will be driven by the market? More people buying electric cars leads to more charging stations.
That's a good question. It's uncertain because our data really can only certain data can go back to 2011 is from what I found. But overall, I think the market will have to definitely lead the way towards greater ZEV sales, which in turn, the state will accommodate for those greater ZEV sales with charging infrastructure. But also a concern about buying ZEV vehicles is that there's not enough charging infrastructure. So it's kind of like you have to find that right balance. Of course, we all know that GM has pledged to sell all new vehicle sales. I believe by 2030, all their vehicle sales will be electric vehicles. And also Governor Newsom signed an executive order that all new sales of light duty trucks and vehicles by 2035 have to be zero emission vehicles. So I think the market will be the main driving force. I hope that it kind of answers your question.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. Great job, Forrest. All right, so then our next student is Sapphire Sandoval, and her home campus is UCLA, and she interned this term at Environment California.
Hello. Okay. The causes of autism spectrum disorders have largely been under-researched despite widespread attention in the late 20th and early 21st century calling for answers. Informed by new studies pointing to correlations between ambient air pollution and autism, I'm determining the correlation between concentrations of particulate matter 2.5 or PM 2.5 and the number of autism cases present in children living in California counties. I'm supposing if a population is exposed to inadequate levels of PM 2.5, then the percentage of children diagnosed with autism will be greater than the percentage of children diagnosed in populations inadequate levels of PM2.5. I'm looking for correlations by comparing autism rates and annual mean concentrations of PM2.5 across 28 of California's best and worst particulate matter polluted counties. As seen in Figure 2, California counties with inadequate levels of PM2.5, shown in red, were more likely to have higher autism rates in children than California counties with adequate PM2.5 levels, shown in green. Then in Figure 4, we see another measurable positive correlation depicted by the regression line, supporting my hypothesis that there is some measurable impact on the neurological health of Californians and consistent exposure to PM2.5 concentrations. These preliminary studies should encourage more research to determine the causality between ambient air pollution and autism, while encouraging the implementation of more regulations and safeguards to minimize ambient air pollution exposure and pollution. Okay.
All right, great. Thank you, Sapphire. And so if there's a question from the audience, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I can go from Environment California. I can go ahead and call on you. All right. And if not, then the academic team. All right. Sharif Amlani.
I'm so sorry, but I cannot hear you. I think you're muted.
Yeah, Sharif, we can't hear you actually. So Sapphire, we can't hear him either. So. All right, why don't we go to Professor Palmer?
Sure. Great job, Sapphire. This looks really great. I have a question. What are some other factors that could possibly be cofactors in this study? Meaning, are there other things that could link higher incidence of autism in these counties that's not air pollution?
Oh, yes. I know that there was like a recent focus on like pollution as a result of like farming and agriculture, like in fertilizers. So along with PM 2.5, when these sources of pollution are put out into the atmosphere, but also like the ground and in like groundwater, these pollutions, they don't exist alone. So that's why I had to be very specific about this. But I also knew that maybe it wasn't specifically PM 2.5 that was like causing this, as opposed, it was just like a correlation because maybe PM 2.5 was being released as the same time or in combination with maybe ozone, but also like maybe fertilizer overuse in like of dangerous chemicals as well. But yeah, I definitely agree that this is probably just like maybe a byproduct or maybe just like associated, but maybe not exactly like the cause.
Great answer. Thanks so much.
All right, great. Wonderful job, Sapphire. Fantastic. All right, so our next student today is Emily Woods, and her home campus is UC Berkeley, and she also interned at Environment California.
Sorry, I have a message saying screen share is failing to start. So let me just try that again. How effective is the California effect? Federalism, federal application, and the Golden State's unique role in US domestic and international policy. Over the course of his presidency, the Trump administration rolled back over 100 environmental regulations, including the Clean Power Plan, leaving the question of whether state and local governments can fill the void. To investigate this, I asked to what extent the California effect, as measured by the number of greenhouse gas reduction policies in other states based on California's policies occurred, and how has this extent changed over time between 1970 and 2020. The California effect is defined as when a government's stricter regulations influence other governments with whom they are economically entwined to adopt stricter policies as well. I hypothesized that the California effect will be strongest with California's earliest environmental policies, as they were often the first models for other states, and that as more states develop their own policies, the California effect will wane. I also posited that a generational California effect will be traceable as states base their policies on models that are themselves adapted California policies. To answer this question, I compared novel California laws to similar laws in other states using the Cortico.io text-to-text comparison tool. I was able to find fewer novel California regulations than expected. Many of the regulations California is known for are not actually the first of their kind, but instead are stronger and more comprehensive variations of policies that were first implemented in another state. Contrary to my hypothesis, the California effect grew stronger over time, with the 2010s having the largest number of novel California policies and the same number of California effect policies as in the 2000s. A couple of theories I have about why this may be, and for further investigation, are that the federal abdication in the climate arena led states to strengthen their own climate policies, and or that climate policy has recently become more salient issue among state legislatures. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Emily. And so we'll go ahead and take a question from the audience first, from anyone from Environment California. I'm going to go ahead and raise your hand. Happy to call on you. All right, and if not, our academic team. All right, Paige Pelton.
Hi, Emily. Really cool project here. My question for you has to do with the states that you chose for your sample. It looks like you looked at Oregon and Washington at the bottom of your poster there. And I'm wondering, do you think that other maybe redder, more conservative states are also taking cues from California, or is this limited to more liberal states?
I looked at every state that had policies based off of similar policies to California. So I first looked at novel California policies and then compared them, looked for laws that are similar in other states. Most of the states I found were more liberal states. With a couple exceptions, there are some more purple states, such as North Carolina, Virginia, and Maine, that did have policies similar to California's that showed a significant correlation between them in similarity.
Nice nuance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. Great job.
Thank you.
All right, so our next student is Natasha Clemonson, whose home campus is UC Santa Cruz, and who this term interned for the Cal Air Resources Board.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so this is Homecomings Through Mental Health Care. So over 151,000 people are estimated to be homeless on any given night in California, and over 1,000 of them died in 2020 in just LA alone. And this homelessness has several causes, but mental illness is one large contributor, with about 2/3 of homeless people estimated to be mentally ill. So because of the number of homeless people suffering from mental illness, I was curious about the relationship between homelessness and mental health resources, and wanted to explore whether or not there's a correlation between the mental health resources in each California county and that county's respective rate of homelessness. So I chose to measure on a county level because counties are core providers of mental health and public health services. And I hypothesized that there is a correlation between a county's mental health resources and homelessness. Because mental health resources are hard to quantify, I used certain indicators of mental health resources as my independent variables. I used mental health care expenditures, number of psychiatrists per county, and GDP as my 3 independent variables, and separately measured how those 3 indicators are associated with homelessness. I chose mental health care expenditure and number of psychiatrists as indicators because of their direct relevance to mental health, and GDP because it is correlated with how many community-based mental health programs there are, with 45% of high-income counties having community-based mental health resources as opposed to 23% of low-income communities. I found data on these 3 indicators in all 58 California counties, as well as data on each county's homeless rates. As you can see in my 3 figures, I found that there is an inverse relationship between all 3 of these indicator variables and homelessness. This means that the more mental health expenditure, available psychiatric help, and higher GDP, the less homelessness there is expected to be in a county. Because of this correlation, it seems that improving mental health resources could be a key first step in reducing the number of homeless people in California counties. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Natasha. And so we'll go over to, and a question for Natasha. Anyone from Cal A or B, if you want to raise your hand, I will go out. Okay, great. So Susan Haig.
Hi, Natasha. This is really great to see, and I'm so impressed about all the work that you've been doing aside from your internship, as well as all the work that you've done for us. So thank you for that. It's a really interesting presentation, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the relationship between homelessness, mental health, and the housing crisis, since housing is a topic that you've been working on with us at CARB.
Hi, Suzanne. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I also found some information or some research that was done that kind of showed that mentally ill people are less likely to be able to maintain housing. I think that, yeah, I mean, there is definitely a correlation, but it kind of showed that improving mental health it also helps improve the ability of homeless people to maintain housing. So there is that correlation.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne, for the question, and then also for hosting Natasha this term. So, and great job, Natasha. And so our next student is Anna Delgado. Her home campus is UC Davis, and she interned for the California Air Resources Board this term.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right, so my research today focuses on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Climate change legislation in the United States is novel on the federal level due to climate change denial and skepticism around the effectiveness of climate change policy, which is why some of the most progressive climate change policies have come from the state level. An example of that here in California would be Senate Bill 32, which has the climate goals of setting 40% below 1990 greenhouse gas emission levels by 2030. A part of our regulation to reach that goal is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, as an active program that reduces greenhouse gas emissions in cooperation with state agencies. The money is garnered from cap and trade option proceeds. My research question is whether the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is effective in reducing emissions, and how is the fund effective on a program based analysis. The hypothesis for my research is if the greenhouse gas program funding increases, then emission reductions will increase as well. My independent variable for this is going to be the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund measured in dollars, and my dependent variable is going to be greenhouse gas emission reductions measured in metric ton carbon dioxide equivalent. My three figures here show how I did my analyses. The first figure being a correlation between my independent and dependent variable, showing a positive correlation between the two, and validating my hypothesis, which is awesome. And a closer level analysis is figure 2, which is a time series analysis of total greenhouse gas reduction funding across years. And what we see is an analysis on the orange line of emission reductions throughout the years. The general trend is that if funding increases, then emission reductions increase as well. However, we do see a dip in 2019. That's because of the introduction of grant programs that work primarily as just granting money and don't necessarily reduce emission reductions. My third figure is a program comparison across program comparison of funding and emission reductions. I've taken the top 10 programs and I based it on log-based comparison for ratio clarity. And the top 3 programs that receive the most funding are transportation programs. However, the program that reduces the most amount of emission reductions is the dairy digester program. In conclusion, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund effectively does reduce emissions, and that there is potential for a larger amount of emission reductions in the future for the transportation sector. However, National Working Lands programs receive like an average level of funding, but are the most cost effective in reducing the largest amount of emissions. Some considerations to take when thinking about my research is technology limits the possible level of emission reductions due to just the limited technology and how much that you can, like, especially in the transportation program, of how much you can reduce it at a given time, because funding for like the transportation program is quite expensive, and getting technology there is also takes time. Some programs work based on a sign up level. So if people don't sign up for the program, then there isn't as much emission reductions. But if more people sign up for their program, there's potential for larger emission reductions. And also that this research is also only a snapshot of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And I suggest that if anybody is more interested in looking at the cost effectiveness or certain programs, or to even sign up for a program yourself, the Climate Investment Division's board Investment Division website has more information for you. My final recommendations are that National Working Land programs like Dairy Digester and CAL FIRE programs should receive more investments so that they can reduce larger amount of emission with lesser amount of funding. And my second recommendation is transportation programs should receive the same level of funding, not less, but also not more, because increased funding may not necessarily mean that you could reduce larger amounts given the limits like technology and expenses. And thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. And so if there is a question from Cal Air Resource Board, you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I'll go ahead and call on you. All right, if not, we'll go ahead and go to the academic team. All right, Professor Butters.
Hey, Anna, Ross here from Paul 186E. Hi, great job. All this looks wonderful. We've talked about it a few times. I really appreciate all the work you've done here. I know it's a lot, and I like using log base on stuff too. I don't think anyone else did that this quarter, so that's great. My question for you is actually just kind of your understanding of what's going on in the background. You mentioned it a couple times, once when you talk about analysis and once when you reiterated it in your conclusion, but you mentioned that the dairy program is the one that's doing a lot of, is most cost effective, I guess. And so what is your understanding about why land programs and dairy program, in particular the Dairy Digestive Research Program, why is that doing the most work for your emission reduction?
That's an awesome question, and the people I interned with in Climate Investment Division grants wish people would ask them more. Partially it's because that, say, the Dairy Digester programs, what it does, the step-by-step process of funding to emission reductions is clearer and like requires lesser steps, and just the process is simpler. So what I'll break it down for you is, so they will the Dairy Digester programs provides funding to different dairies across California, and what they are able to do with that money is to have a digester process. And by being able to create a digester processing like facility, it's basically a giant dome for the manure, they're able to produce renewable methane gas. And just by doing that, they can reduce large amounts of emissions by just having a digester on their dairy. So the step-by-step process for, say, the Dairy Digester Program, it's pretty clear. You give them the money and they build the facility, and large emission reductions are being able to finish within a short amount of time. Or say for sustainable agricultural lands or CAL FIRE, those are also natural working land programs. CAL FIRE, I think, is pretty intuitive. CAL FIRE programs like the CAL FIRE Prevention Program simply just puts money into reducing the amount of California wildfires that occurs during a given year. And I think it's pretty intuitive how just provide the money and being able to prevent, like, lesser the severity of a wildfire, how much like carbon emissions that would like prevent overall. So I think, yeah, the logic of the step-by-step funding for natural working lands and how like emission reductions can be reduced overall is just infinitely more simple as compared to transportation programs like Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, which is an intercity transportation, which costs a lot of money to keep up and also a lot of money to update the technology in it. So it's just this, it's simpler and it's less expensive.
Fantastic. That was a very thorough answer. I appreciate that. Great job, Anna.
All right, great. Thank you. Great job, Anna. And so then our next student is Anna Pels, and her home campus is UC San Diego. And this term, she interned with Cal EPA's Environmental Justice Unit.
Right. In recent years, wildfire severity and the length of wildfire season have increased dramatically in California. Anecdotal evidence from news interviews has shown some Californians leaving the state as a result. However, whether these patterns are generalizable to the broader California population is not yet clear. This brings up the question, how does wildfire severity affect outmigration from California counties, and how is this relationship different between rural and urban counties? I hypothesize that as the cost of property damaged in wildfires increases, outmigration will also increase. I expect to see a more positive correlation among urban counties because residents in urban counties may have the resources to migrate more easily when faced with the threat of wildfires. To test my hypothesis, I conducted a time series analysis examining dollar damage per capita and outmigration per capita from 45 California counties, averaged over 5-year intervals between 2008 and 2017. As is shown in Figure 3, I found a much more positive correlation between dollar damage and outmigration within urban counties than within rural counties. However, the sharply negative relationship shown in Figure 4 between median income and outmigration in severe wildfire years suggests that the mechanism causing the relationship shown in Figure 3 is likely not increased resources among people, residents in urban counties. Regardless of the mechanism causing this relationship, these findings still have serious social and political implications for California. My recommendation is that state and local governments consider fire resistance in all new infrastructure construction, especially in urban counties. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. And so if there is a question from Cal EPA, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I'll go ahead and call on you and unmute you on our end. All right, and if not, we'll go over to the academic team if there's a question from the academic team. All right, Professor Pantoja.
Hi, Anna. Great job. This is a very interesting project. So I just wanted to ask, if not resources, what other mechanisms you think are at play?
Yeah, so one thing that I think would be challenging to measure, but might be a cause, is that people in rural counties might have occupations that are more tied to the land. So if they're faced with the threat of wildfires, moving would entail losing their lifestyle or their occupation. It would entail a major lifestyle change, whereas in urban counties, you know, especially now, folks might be able to work remotely, but in general, folks might be able to maintain a similar lifestyle while migrating to an area that doesn't come with the side effects of wildfire impacts.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. Great job. And so then our next student is Renee Applegate, and her home campus is UC Davis. And this term, she interned with the California Housing and Community Development Office, or HCD.
Welcome, everybody. This afternoon, I will be talking about the effects of local zoning patterns. California is experiencing one of the worst housing affordability crises in state history due to a severe housing supply shortage. The state needs to build more housing, but powerful local opposition, echoing "not in my backyard" rhetoric, has perpetuated local zoning actions that block non-market rate housing developments. which leads us to this critical question: how do local zoning restrictions impact housing choices for low-income communities of color? I argue that as local zoning restrictions increase, the percentage of low-income communities of color decrease. I have conducted a policy comparison from the fifth housing element cycle of 6 San Diego County cities, 2 low, 2 mid, and 2 high income level cities. To measure local housing restrictions as my independent variable, I looked at 3 significant zoning factors to build a zoning restriction index, with a score of 3 being the most restrictive. To measure the exclusion of low-income communities of color as my dependent variable, I analyzed the area's median household income level and the population percentage of non-Hispanic white residents. Through my research, I found that higher income cities had the highest zoning restriction index score, as shown in Figure 3, and higher income cities also had the highest proportion of non-Hispanic white residents, as shown in Figure 4. Based on these findings, local governments should adopt a maximum allowable density above 30 units per acre and prioritize multifamily projects over single-family projects in order to create more inclusive and fair communities. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd be glad to answer any questions from the audience at this time.
Great job, Renee. Thank you. And so if there is a question from HCD, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I'll go ahead and call and unmute you. All right, Paul McDougall.
Well, fantastic work, Renee. Thank you for all your efforts. So when you're looking at all these zoning codes and all these different practices for local governments, did you find any particularly nefarious activities, with respect to promoting more inclusion?
What do you like? Can you elaborate further?
Did anything stick out as like real barriers to housing choices?
Yes, actually, I found that so for my zoning factors that I looked at 3. I looked at multifamily housing unit to single family housing unit ratios less than 1. So a city with a ratio less than 1 that equaled 1 point in terms of the zoning restriction index score. And then for the second factor, I also looked at maximum allowable densities below 30 units per acre. And so with a city that had a maximum allowable density below 30 units per acre, that would equal a score of 1 for that category. And then for the third and last factor I looked at absent inclusionary requirements. So a city who had an absent inclusionary requirement from their municipal zoning code, that equaled to 1. And what I found was that the top 2 zoning factors that led to more exclusive communities were the first 2 zoning factors of the multifamily housing unit to single family housing unit ratio less than 1, as well as the maximum allowable density below 30 units per acre. Yeah, that's to answer your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul, for the question and for hosting Renee this term. And Renee, great job on your presentation today.
Thank you.
All right, so our next student is Robert Anthony, whose home campus is UCLA, and this term he interned with Capital Weekly.
Just one thing. My name is actually Anthony Robert.
All right.
Cool. And I'll pull up my presentation. In recent years, California has been ravaged by record-breaking wildfires and extreme droughts caused by climate change. Automobiles have been a major contributor to global warming due to their heavy reliance on oil, major fossil fuel, and greenhouse gas, as seen in Figure 1. Can urban planning reforms contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? My research questions are: does population density cause a decline in greenhouse gas emissions? And is transit mode share correlated with greenhouse gas emissions per capita per city? My hypothesis is, if California and its major cities focus on reducing private vehicle mode share and increasing population densities, the state's greenhouse gas emissions will decline due to a decreased need for automobiles. For my methodology, I created 2 scatter plots with my data and ran a simple linear regression. And my main findings were that greenhouse gas emissions were negatively correlated with population density, and they were positively correlated with the transit mode share taken up by private vehicles per world cities, both of which were calculated to be strong. And from these results, some important policy implications are California and its cities can do their part to lower greenhouse gas emissions by adopting policies that will increase population density and reduce private vehicle mode share. And one example of such a policy would be maybe a gas tax to help raise funds for transportation, or possibly adopting zoning reforms aimed at encouraging transit usage, possibly modeled off previous legislation such as SB 827. Thank you.
All right, great. And if there is a question from the audience from Capitol Weekly, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I'll be able to call on you and unmute you on our end. All right, and if not, then a question from the academic team. All right, Paige Pelton.
Hi, Anthony. Thank you for this project. My question was about whether or not these denser cities and counties you've identified, do they also have stronger or more elaborate transit systems? And do you find that to be sort of one of the causal mechanisms in your study?
Definitely, like, comparing, like if you compare, say, Paris, France to Dallas, Texas, like Paris has a lot more like of an advanced transit system. And I also find that to be an important causal mechanism in reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Great job, everyone. So now I'm going to go ahead and give Brooke a chance to go ahead and stop the recording.